think what I'm going to do is we may have people joining us a little bit into the session, but we've got a good amount right now. I want to take this time to thank everybody for coming, and also to let you know that Rosalind Child is the new co-chair for the Project Management Roundtable. Rosalind is a senior associate at SAM Architecture, and she actually presented our August 25th session, Managing Unresolved Issues, Insight from the SAM and OPM's perspective. And we're really happy to have her on board. And Rosalind's going to just talk a little bit more about herself, and then she will begin the presentation. Thanks, Rosalind.
Sure. Yeah, so I think, like I mentioned at the beginning of the last session, I'm a little bit newer to the project management role. Of course, I say that, and then I think about it. It's like, all right, it's been a couple of years, but it still feels kind of new. And but I think, like I mentioned before, I feel like I've kind of like found the part of architecture I really like doing more than I ever thought I would. I kind of shied away from project management for a while, but kind of got sucked into it. Now I'm all about it. And I kind of stumbled upon the PM Roundtable knowledge community this spring and listened to a bunch of the recorded sessions, and found the conversations to be very like helpful, validating in some cases, and insightful. And it's just really nice to hear from other people going through, struggling with the same things, and working through the same issues. So I'm excited to be co-chairing and starting to kind of like steer some of these conversations that we're having. So I think with that, we can jump into the topic for this session, which is talking about really what exactly is the project manager role. And I know kind of in the description for this session, we included this kind of the role description, which actually Patty, the previous chair, had put together for Cambridge 7. They had asked her to put something together as they've been talking about what exactly the project manager role is. And it was interesting as she mentioned this to me. I'm like, oh, that's interesting, because we've also been talking about this a lot in our office. And it sounds like it's, an ongoing discussion of defining this role and defining project management versus the project architect. And yeah, so I think this might be like a good jumping off point for the discussion today. I don't know if anyone took some time to read through this. I'm assuming maybe not. So maybe I'll hit some of the high points to kind of start off. Some of the things that kind of jumped out to me was that, the project manager serves as the primary liaison with the client. They do the office administrative tasks related to the project, project team assignments, kind of like the broad categories of their responsibilities include planning, organizing, and staffing the project, facilitating the work, monitoring progress, and concluding the project. And some of the things in here that I thought were particularly like, I'm curious what other people think about these responsibilities landing in the project manager's plate is, reviewing and approving timesheets and expense reports. I know, for example, Patty had mentioned at Cambridge 7, that was something that people were kind of like, is that really the project manager's role? And I'll be honest, at SOM, I don't do that. I know I had worked at Stantec before, and the project managers did do it there. So I'm kind of curious how other firms approach that. And then things like designing and delivering presentations. For example, I know sometimes, I don't know, I think that kind of falls in the project architect's role, sometimes not. That seems like something that may swing either way. And then like handling invoices is another kind of like admin thing that I think some project managers shy away from. I'm curious how other firms handle it. But yeah, so I'm curious if anyone had any like initial reactions to those particular topics, this kind of description in general. Kind of open it up to discussion.
Hi, this is Tracy Markey. I am practice as both an architect and an OPM as well. And in my past experience, both the OPM and the architect have reviewed payment applications. So it's sort of like a double check, but the architect still has to sign off on it. And that's because of the contractual requirements to certify the project at the end, I believe. Could be wrong. I don't know if anybody else can talk about that.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, I saw you unmuted there, Drake.
Yes, everything on this list is, in my experience, required of project managers in larger firms. And it's something that I've done since my first project management job here in Boston. So I'm going to have to cut off here. I've got my outside lawn guys going, but anyhow, let me mute myself.
Oh, that's okay. I mean, I could hear it, but I could still hear you pretty well. So yeah, I guess. Oh, Tracy, I saw you unmuted yourself as well.
Yeah, well, your primary question is sort of like, how did the OPM and architecturals overlap, right? And I mean,
Well, I guess more specifically, like the architectural project manager, so the project manager on the architecture team.
right.
Yeah.
But I mean, I feel like the OPM role has been carved out of the architectural scope for the most part. I mean, it provides some third party, so some checks and balances, which I think owners really appreciate. But it sort of detracts from the idea of the master builder, which most architects aren't these days anyway, because there are so many things we need to be experts in. So, I mean, I think no matter what way you look at the OPM role, it pulls from the architectural scope.
Yeah. And I guess, again, like, let me clarify, when we're talking about the project manager in this context, like, I'm not separate from the OPM. So, but I see what you're saying, like the OPM, yes, that scope does carve out of like the architect as like the designer.
Yeah.
But yes, we're talking kind of about the project manager from the design team.
Okay.
That's okay. I think that was worth clarifying for everyone.
Yes, if I can jump back in here, the role of the OPM is very broad and encompasses keeping an eye out for the owner's purposes, the work of the contractor, and all of the consultants. What you've got in this list is the internal management role of the project manager, of the architectural team, and the architectural consultants. So it's two different roles using the same title. So it's a little misleading in that regard. But in terms of all of the activities you've listed here, if you were to go to a job listing for some of the major companies, you mentioned Stantec, they all have these exact same responsibilities. And it is the role of the project manager to do these things. However, you also note that the role of the project manager will vary from firm to firm. So in some firms, for example, in a studio system, the studio leader may do some of these things. In some firms, the admin staff will check some of the things like time cards. And it also varies depending on the kind of project that people are engaged in. So I think that there's nothing in this list that should shock anybody who's called a project manager. I worked in one firm, however, where there was one of the principals who did most of this stuff, and the folks that were doing the so-called project management were actually project architects, making sure that the production of the work was done. In larger firms, that would be strictly the role of the project architect. However, the doing contracts, for example, some firms it's done by the principals only, and sometimes it's done with the involvement of the project manager. So there's a lot of variability to it. But I would say that across the board of the very large companies, these tasks are the responsibility of the project manager.
Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of points that we've talked about internally too, where and like it can vary from firm to firm, the size of the firm, the size of the projects you're working on. I know, for example, at SOM, we've historically had a good number of smaller or like mid-sized projects that where people kind of wear both hats, the PM and PA roles. And, I think as we've been growing and doing more larger projects, I think we're starting to realize that we need to define the difference between those a little bit better. I see Kevin, you're nodding. Maybe you've experienced similar challenges. Yeah, and I'm curious. So I don't know, Kevin, it sounds like that topic is speaking to you. Do you have any particular
Yeah,
words of wisdom there?
yeah, I mean, I was going to chime in on that I think this description embodies very well the unique responsibilities of the project manager. I agree with the things you underlined and read, that some of these more administrative, a couple of them which are sort of administrative, depending on the structure of the firm. For us, we have a director of operations. He approves timesheets, he approves expense reports. So it's sort of a firm structure question, I think, in terms of those things. But um, to other point that was being raised, the line, that it's the one item on here that starts to get at designing and delivering presentations. And I think there's also one about identifying the project team members, the required scope of services, roles and responsibilities. That's right on the edge with project architects. And I feel like we often struggle in understanding. We have the project manager role pretty well understood and defined, but the project architect role not so well defined. So sometimes there isn't really that role. Sometimes people think they're in that role, but it's not clear what they're supposed to be doing. Sometimes that person is really just helping the design principal, develop their design, and the things that one might traditionally associate with the project architect, like managing the document set, quality control, figuring out how to put the building together and build the building and coordinate with the consultant team members. A lot of that ends up falling back on the project manager, and the project manager kind of ends up being the overburdened jack of all trades person who's responsible for anything and everything. And I think I've been struggling with seeing that feeling that happening on myself sometimes, and seeing that happening with colleagues. As I'm also in a sort of adjunct operations role, working on staffing and other studio operations. So I see this happening as we build other project teams, and it's definitely a constant an ongoing struggle, and the question of would defining it help? Is that something people have gone through? I'd be interested to hear about.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say everything I feel like you're describing speaks to me a lot, and I'd be curious what, Kevin, I don't know, you happen to be speaking up, so I don't know, like, does the PM or PA usually do the QA QC, and like who, like if you're say in the study phase of a project and you're writing the report, is the PM writing the report, or is like a PA writing the report, the PM's reviewing it? How does that division? I don't know, maybe it's just a project by project basis, but
Yeah, those things tend to be project by project, but usually I think a lot of the let's see, writing reports and thinking about the messaging of the meetings. If it's not strictly like design oriented, it often is the project manager, at least in thinking about my experiences, and often with the principal as well.
Right.
But yeah, that does tend to fall that way. And then QA QC tends to be mostly within a project manager's group. I mean, we actually have a kind of QA/QC group that identifies, upcoming project milestones and says, okay, we need to plan for a review for this, and we do third-party reviewers, but the people who organize that are PMs or operations people, and the people who do the reviews are a mix of people who are in project management or project architect roles, but have traditionally been mostly project managers.
Yeah.
So there's like kind of like if it's technical, it leans PM, and if it's like artistic, I'll say, it leans PA. And I'm really interested in having, I kind of have been struggling and wondering the question, if does defining a PA role that encompasses more make that happen, so that we can kind of pull the line back and have the PAs responsible for more things, and have more kind of equity in team dynamic, about these two people working together to kind of lead the execution.
Yeah. Laura, I see you just popped on.
So I'll just say at PCA, we've been working on more of a partnership between project architect and project managers. We have recently more clearly defined what the roles are within those realms, but on project teams are working on partnering people so that you don't necessarily have to do just the things within the project architect realm, depending on people's strengths and abilities and where they want to learn and grow. But that all of the things within those realms have to be done, and there has to be a clear coordination, because we are finding that the leaders of these teams are being taxed and aren't having as much time to mentor younger staff as we would like. And so we also have a QA/QC group. We have several different people who act in like a 4-hour-a-week role on jobs to help supplement where, the PA and the PM have the final responsibility on things, but they are not the ones who are solely doing it. They have the support that they need. So all the tasks listed here, we do find fall within that project manager role. And it's important to have the support and partnership of the PA, because we think the biggest difference is the PM needs to be focused on the big picture, moving the thing forward, getting the decisions from the client that are needed. And the PA needs to be focused on, do we have all the information to get this thing built? And is the team moving in a direction that clearly documents what needs to be documented? And together, the big picture and the focus are the things that, if they're partnering, get a project successfully to the end. It's always a struggle, and the more complex the projects, obviously the more challenging, but it's that partnership and the support of others from the QA/QC group and from senior leadership that we are working on bolstering their supporting them more. So
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And this idea of partnering and like the shared responsibilities and kind of, Kevin, like you said, equity between those two roles is definitely something we've been talking about too, is like, there seems to be this perception. And when we were talking to Patty leading up to this meeting, one of the things she brought up as well was this perception that like the PM is the top of the hierarchy on the project team, and like of the architect career ladder, it is the top rung, maybe unless other than principal or ownership in the firm kind of thing. And that maybe that's not really, that shouldn't be the case, right? Like that shouldn't be the right?
I'll
like
say that is specifically why we started talking about this, because we found everyone was going on one path, and we're 75-ish people now, and we need maybe 75 different paths. We need everyone to pick their own path and to understand what their strengths are. And not everyone is meant to be or wants to be a project manager. And not everyone is meant to be nor should they be a project. You know, we all have our own strengths. And so illustrating that leadership isn't just being a project manager. There are lots of ways that you can be a leader, and there are lots of ways that you can grow within a firm. And if you lean into what your strengths are, that's way more important than filling these traditional roles that say, okay, you've made it to the project manager level, so now you run the project,
Yeah,
which
right.
is false. There are so many valuable components to a project team. So that is more recent. Within the past year or so, we've kind of redefined a lot of things and are talking a lot about different things in our mentorship programs to highlight that there's not just one way to go.
Yeah, I feel like what you just said could have been like exactly the conversations we were having recently. And I'm curious, like you said, it sounds like you guys have been working on this for the last year. Like what have you guys been doing in terms of mentorship and like encouraging growth in that project architect? I know this is kind of getting off topic of the PM role, but you know, this is all related. I'm curious what you guys have done in that department.
Yeah, so we've always had a strong foundation to play around with, and that foundation is our mentoring program. And years ago, we kind of wrote out levels, and we had like 6 levels, and they clearly defined like once you're in this realm, you have these skills, and then once you're in this realm, you have these skills. And in that definition, it was that more traditional, once you're at the top level, you're doing project management things. So what we did was we rewrote the whole thing, and it was less about levels and more about paths. So you have the core foundation of what you need to learn. So everyone from school up into a certain point is in like core 1, 2, or 3, but then it gets into their design leads, there are project architects, and there are project managers. And as you're getting into the industry, you can learn about a bunch of different things, and you don't have to pick one path. And then maybe at a certain point, you find that you're more inclined to do a certain thing, and you can grow in that path. But, you know, defining that all 3 of those components, not just the project architect and the project manager, all 3 of those elements are key to the success of a project. And so there's write-ups on it now, and there's a lot of conversation about how those 3 elements work together in, you know, the project leadership group for each project. So through our mentoring program, we've been working with people on identifying, we call them their designations. So are they a PA PM? Are they a junior PA? Whatever their experiences are, and what are they interested in? Are they doing PA work now, but they want to learn about project management, or they want more design experience? So making sure that we're having conversations with everyone to help illustrate that it's about getting varied experiences, and it's about choosing your own path within the definitions that we've defined.
If I might interject, one of the biggest differences between project staffing of any level is their degree of experience. So typically the project manager tends to be the person with the most experience across the board in all areas of doing projects. The exception to that is the senior project architect. In larger firms, this is a person who would typically have a preference for putting a building together using the technical means at our disposal. It used to be paper and pencil. Nowadays we do it with computers. But that person typically would, 100 years ago, that person would have been called the green eye shades guy, the person that basically sits down and details everything. And whereas getting the project through all of the non-specifically documenting the work part of the work, that would fall to somebody like the project manager. The project manager in larger firms is not producing the drawings. The project manager makes sure that the work is being reviewed, sometimes participating in it. Obviously, with a lot of experience, there's a lot that you bring to that kind of review. the project architect who's leading the work for making the documents, for getting the specs done, for answering questions. That's a role that some people prefer to do. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I joined a large firm as a project manager, and there was a project that we were working on. It was a high-rise condominium project in downtown Boston, and the project architect had been wearing two hats. He was the project manager and the project architect. Well, for those of you who've done this kind of work, you can appreciate that that poor guy was under a lot of pressure. And in fact, I would say that he did all he could to keep from crying. And so when I joined the team, he was beyond thanking me. He says, I don't want to see the contractor ever. I don't want to go into the field ever. I want to sit and do what I do best, which is solve technical problems of how to build a building. We have a design team. The design team does a design, and I make the whole thing come together. But I want somebody else to go out there and have to do the work with the contractors. That's really not what I want to do as the project architect. But we should back up and look at the big picture. These roles are oftentimes part of the of two things. One is the work plan, where you identify all of the stuff that has to be done to get a building through the whole process. That is usually the responsibility of the project manager and the project architect collaborating. So I think that that's where the idea of teaming is really meets, where that meets the road. The project architect will do a first pass. Project manager will scrutinize that and add his experience or her experience to that review. That then becomes part of a larger work plan. The larger work plan, as I do them, includes all of the consultants, all of the reviews. We identify all of the cost elements that go into getting the work done, not just through the through the schematics, design, development, and construction drawings, but all the way through to the end of construction. So the work plan has to encompass that in considerable detail. That's also the primary tool that I use for identifying all of the costs, all the things that have to be budgeted, everything that has to be paid for out of the project fee. That's a really big part of the work. The other thing is that the project architect leads the staff in terms of doing all of the implementation of the design. But this is where you get into some nuances depending on how the firm works. In a smaller firm, I used to have my own firm, the project principal did everything. So as a principal of the firm, I would do the design. I would it started at the beginning. You meet with the client, you develop a contract, you identify the scope of the work, and then you work with your team to design the project. Sometimes you delegate parts of that. Sometimes you do it yourself. And then you go in through the different phases, as we've classically called them, from schematic design all the way through doing the working drawings. And so in a small firm, the principal wears all the hats, and the staff are mostly less experienced people who would not really be suitable to doing, let's say, project management or even being project architect. As you develop your experience, obviously you move up into those other roles.
Yeah, thanks. Something I think, several people have kind of hit on, it seems to be a bit of a trend, that is that people kind of getting promoted out of their roles because, say, for example, they're a great project architect or staff architect, and looking at that like traditional hierarchy, that the default is that they get promoted into PM and being a PM, and going back to that, I don't know, I just think that's an interesting trend, not just in architecture, but in other industries, is that you're really great at what you do, great, so you get promoted to a different position, which is not what you were really great at doing, but it's just like the default, like moving up the ladder of things. And I think the discussions around kind of developing people as project architects and supporting them in that role, I think helps like address that a little bit. Like if you are a great project architect and that's what you like doing, like let's grow people in that role.
I think
Yeah, and
Laura
I
had it
think
perfectly right. Laura, I think you had it perfectly right. People should seek out their own pathway to to their satisfaction. If they're going to be working as a project architect and they have no interest in following budgets and looking at milestones and stuff, they shouldn't move into that role. So I think you're right. You need to look to develop your own pathway.
Yeah, and I think the other component of that, and this is what I found when I did my first job as a project manager, is that it's the one role that we have absolutely no training in.
Yes.
It's everything about it is so far removed from what actually. It's important that you know how a building goes together and you understand big picture what a project is, but it's finance and it's business development. I mean, business development is along the way, but there are so many things that I had to teach myself because I don't have a master's in business administration and I didn't have any financial classes. And so, we teach ourselves within the office, but it's the first role that traditionally you get promoted, you're in this realm of like, okay, we'll just go be a project manager now. And you're like, okay, but what is that? Like, what do I do? And so part of this idea of partnering and supporting is identifying people who are interested in the concept of project management at a much earlier point in their career and providing access to it, whether it be junior PMs that are identifying that there can be junior PMs, mid-level PMs, and senior PMs, and then partnering them with people who are at a senior level who've done it before, who can help them get into what it means to do all of these things, so that it isn't so overwhelming. Because I think part of what I found as a project manager being stretched so much was that it wasn't just the day-to-day tasks, it was like figuring out how to do the day-to-day tasks. And not that I didn't have an office full of people who had also done that before, but we had all kind of made it up in the way that we did it. And also, I find that specifically with the financial side, we all think differently. I process numbers differently than my coworker processes numbers, and I need my brain to organize things differently than somebody else needs to organize things, and they're all valid and everyone needs to find their own way to do it. So it was just a very complicated role to jump into, and so trying to not have the traditional path of like you only do it if you've done all these other things, but that you do it in small increments and start to learn about it, so that by the time you are the sole project manager on a project, you have at least a little bit of experience and you have kind of created your way of doing it based on learning from others.
Laura, you hit on a very critical issue here. How does one get to be a project manager? How do you learn the stuff that goes into doing it? So there are several avenues that I've experienced. When I opened my own office, I had no prior experience being a project manager. I was a pretty young guy at the time, and it was basically sink or swim. It was not a pretty sight. It was not very painless. I wish it had been. But when I went to work for larger firms, what I found is that they have, the better ones at least, have actually created their own in-house training for project managers. They create their own project manager's manual. It identifies the various tasks that a project manager does. So all of the things on this list, for example, would have its own paragraph or chapter in the project manual. So if your firm doesn't have such a thing, I think that would be a good starting point, is just to take that list and develop it into a book that says this is what we expect you to do, and this is how we propose that you do it. And that way, everybody will be at the same set of criteria. You'll be working to the same standard for everybody doing project management. Another opportunity that's available, and I strongly recommend it because I actually did it, is Harvard has a course in the Harvard Extension in project management. It's, as you know, the Harvard Extension courses are at night, and they're semester long. So you spend a lot of time focusing on that particular subject. So the project management course that I took covered almost all of the issues in this list, and then a great deal of other topics as well, some of which won't necessarily apply to what we do. A third avenue is there is a company called PSMJ, which was created by a guy named Stasiowski 40 or 50 years ago, that trains people in project management. The instructors in that program are the lead project managers or operations managers in major organizations. 32M Hill, whatever, I don't remember the exact name, conducted the course when I took it. The reason I took it isn't because I needed it. It's because the operations manager where I was working was thinking that this would be a good course for the company to require all of its project managers to take, but he wanted to do a test run. So he and I took the course together to see if this would meet our needs. And in fact, it would, and I would recommend it to you. The course, the way it's conducted, is that it is if I remember now, it's 2 weeks. It's 8 hours a day or 7.5 hours a day, 5 days a week. So it's a crash program. So you're out of the office for 2 weeks, basically. And you're in this classroom and you go through all of these issues in considerable detail. And you learn how to do, and this is geared specifically to architects. So if you want to learn how to be a project manager, I speak very highly of that program. So that's the other way of going about it. So I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful to know those resources exist. And yeah, thanks for bringing up training of architects, because that is, or sorry, training of project managers, because also something that we've talked about, and I had actually kind of mentally flagged for a future session. It could probably be a significant discussion there, is how different firms handle it, but both of you covered that really nicely, so that was helpful. Another thing I wanted to bring up, which I think was a comment that came up in our office that I thought might be interesting to get people's reaction to, is that someone made the comment that, a PM doesn't actually have to be an architect. The PM could theoretically be just an administrative person, was the comment. And I'm curious what people's reaction to that comment is.
I mean, I think, if you look at the list that you wrote up, it is very administrative, but that's the quantitative side of project management in my mind. There's a qualitative side about, understanding, like being able to sit in a meeting with the full project team and understand what needs to happen in that meeting in order to move things forward and to ensure that deadlines are being met. And I think that, we have this conversation with our director of HR, where a lot of times she says, well, I don't do architecture, so I can't contribute to the conversation in the way that you can. So I do think that there is a critical component of in order to do it well, I think you do need to be an architect and understand and have experience in the field to know how projects come together.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to bring up is at HMFH, when I first started with the company, I was the staff accountant who did the billing. I did a lot of the office and project related finances. And I started to notice that some of the administrative duties that the project managers and project directors were doing was something that I could take on, which would enable me to learn more about the project. It would help me understand the finances. So we kind of carved out a niche about what actually the project, in my case, the project accounts manager could help the project manager and project director do in order for them to do their jobs better. What administrative duties could I do in order to free their time up? So that was one of the things that I did that kind of touched upon a lot of the administrative duties that you have in the list, ones. So I think that's kind of like a good point to bring up as far as, are there things that perhaps the accounting department or finance department, somebody could do in order to help out the PM and the project director with their role. I don't know what I would do if the project manager wasn't an architect, because honestly, a lot of what I'm learning is through them and the project directors. So it's been very beneficial, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about the project admin side.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy.
Yeah, just to add one more thing to it, I think I agree that with Laura that there are, while we as project managers, like, we're not trained in project management in school, you kind of have to learn through doing. There is still elements of problem solving and design in the project management role that of course our architecture training and education help with. And one of our principals likes to say that the project managers, it's not that we don't focus on design, but we focus on designing the process. So I think that there is a way in thinking about, in the sort of problem solving, road mapping, thinking that we do, that that architects, being an architect is has uniquely contributes to doing well.
Yeah, I think what you just described there speaks to me a lot, is like the designing of the process and like planning of it. And I think it's also hard to plan that process and organize it if you have not also done it. And then similarly, if you're the person kind of representing the design team to the client, hard to do that, I think, effectively if you have not done it. You're not like, don't fully, if you're trying to advocate like, okay, our team needs this amount of time to do this, like you've got to be able to articulate why. And I think it's
Guiding
harder
decision making.
Yeah.
You have to
Knowing
know what it
you
means.
Exactly. You need to know, what do you need to know to make the decision in both directions? Like, what does the design team need to know? What does the client need to know? And you're kind of like that in between.
If I might add to that, I think Kevin is correct but I would suggest that there's two parts to project management. The one part is the very broad concepts that apply to any project in any industry that you have to organize and you have to account for, that you have limited resources, which is your money. You have responsibilities for schedules, for end products, and so on. Those broad concepts are worth learning. They are wholly part of what we do in architecture, but they also apply to every field. So that was why I mentioned the Harvard course, because it covers basically what you need to know, regardless of what industry you're in. You're still dealing with certain strategic concerns, limited resources, limited time, and responsibilities to accomplish an end product. But then I think Laura and Tracy are quite right. There's some specific stuff that is unique to what we do as architects. And that's where the architect as project manager is the core solution to how we do larger projects. When you get into smaller projects where the PM and the PA are the same person, that can work. But I've worked on a large project at Boston University years ago, where on one of the projects, the fellow in charge was both PA and PM. And unfortunately, because he was doing both, he didn't do either one of them particularly well. They are unique requirements. If I went to Tracy and said, Tracy, I don't know what to do with my budget, I've got a problem. Tracy could help me with that. But if I don't know that I've got the problem because I'm focusing on the design and getting the drawings done or doing construction administration, then I'm not helping Tracy and I'm not helping my team. So you need to, so in larger projects, I'm saying is you need to separate those responsibilities to the extent that you can. So for example, in this particular case, I remember I was asked to jump in and help with the punch list at the end of the project. And so I was going through the building and there were some major public spaces in the building, and the transitions between the main entrance and the grand stairway, getting into the upper levels of the building, you come up the stair and there's a transition to the walls and flooring and so on. They were not studied. They were missed because the fellow who was the PA didn't do the PA. He was too busy being the project manager. That's really unacceptable. You don't want to put yourself into that position. So I think the idea of separating those two is critical in large projects. Large firms do large projects for the most part. If you're doing a small project, even there you need somebody who's got a third eye, keeping an eye on stuff. You can't see everything. So separating the two roles, I think, is really a very important benefit to the team. And if you can learn the big picture issues of what a PM is supposed to do, I think you'll be better able to focus on meeting the responsibilities in the list.
Yeah, you bring up or make me think of a question, just kind of speaking out loud here is, do you think it's a question to everyone? Is it better to have people who are just a PM or just a PA and maybe work on several different projects versus trying to combine those roles so that there's like one combined PM PA for a smaller project versus splitting that between, am I explaining this in a way that makes sense? Like instead of having one person do PM PA for a small project and another one do PM and PA for another small project, does it make sense for just one person to PM both of them and one person to PA both of them? So those roles are a little more defined. I don't know.
The answer is yes.
You think, yeah.
Yes. In some of the offices I've worked, I would be the PM on 6 or 7 projects. Some of them would be very small. The PA would be basically doing whatever the size project was. But in a couple of cases, the operations manager wanted to develop a particular project architect so that that person could become a project manager. So my role as PM wasn't just to keep an eye on the stuff in this list, but also to mentor that younger person in the skills and the things you need to pay attention to be a project manager. So I would delegate some of the PM activities to the PA to the extent that he had the time to do them. And then I would just keep an eye on it to make sure that things were progressing appropriately.
Yeah, I'm curious if anyone else has. I don't know that. I think that was my that tends to be my instinct to fully separate those roles. But I know there are also people who, I don't know, either haven't decided which path they want to go down or like the combination of responsibilities. So
I think it can really depend on the person, because I know I have a very hard time switching between big picture thinking and like small picture thinking. So when I've had to be like PM, PA, and drafter like all at once, that was incredibly difficult. But I could switch like between two projects more easily than like these different ways of thinking about the project.
yeah, that's a good point. It's like telescoping in scale, right? Like thinking big picture, like how are we getting the project done? What's the project budget? To like, all right, what color base are we using in the corridor?
Right.
Yeah, thanks, Juliana. I think that's a good point.
Yeah, I think that's where we were finding most of, and we still have it, most of the stress is when people are trying to do two different roles that require two different trains of thought. And it's not that they couldn't solely do one or the other. They just, it's not as successful when you do it at the same time. And so I think keeping that role specific to projects and having one person in that role on multiple projects is beneficial from a standards perspective, ensuring that, you know, more projects are doing similar things and meeting all of the standards within the office. And there's lots of benefits to that. And, you know, you also have to have the right people available. And, you know, there's always the real life scenarios of like, yes, this is what we would love to be doing, but you know, we do still, most of our projects are very large, but we do still have some small projects that people are doing both. And we just can't get out of that mentality just because timing is what it is. So
Yeah, that's a good point.
One of the biggest stress generators for people doing architecture, if they're wearing two hats, if they're the PA and the PM, is what do you do when you get to the deadlines? So for example, you're trying to get all of the documents prepared for either a specific milestone or a particular meeting. And meanwhile, you've also got the deadlines in the office for getting the billing out and making sure that you've got all the time cards up to date. And then you have to write a report for the building department or what have you. Those things can soak up all of the person's time. And then the end result is a person just burns out. And so I would suggest what Laura was saying is, you know, if you can separate those two, and if you can have one person doing 5 or 6 project management projects and somebody else will do the project architectural work, I think you're better served.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And this also brings up another kind of question that has crossed my mind is, do you, again, opening this up to everyone, do you know, what about when people change their minds partway through their career? Like they're a PA and they want to switch to being a PM or vice versa. Do you know anyone who's become a PM and then you wanted to go back to being a PA? And, you know, like, yeah, I'm just curious because it feels kind of like a bifurcated, you know, like you're kind of picking one path or the other, but how much do people really kind of zig between them?
yeah, I mean, I'll say when we clearly defined what a project manager was, we had a lot of people go, oh no, never mind. That's not what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it's important to not do that when you're on a project, like stay in the role on a project, but outside of project work, you know, it's your life and your career, and, you know, you can, I believe, change your mind whenever you want. And as long as you have the experience and the support, then that, you know, go for it.
I have one thing to add to that.
Sure. Yeah.
If you're pretty far advanced in doing project management and you've done that for years and you want to do project architectural work, we have changed as an industry over the last century. We don't do things with pencil and paper anymore. So if I was a PM in 1900, and I wanted to go back to being a project architect, it's no big problem. I pick up my pencil and I start drawing. Nowadays, if you wanted to do that, you'd have to go back and learn AutoCAD or Revit or one of the other CAD programs. These are very time consuming, very knowledge intensive, and it's a skill all of its own. So I don't see in the 21st century architects going back from being a project manager into being a project architect unless they have made those transitions very recently and they still have this, the skills are still current.
I know I'm kind of banking on Revit being the tool of choice for a while. Keep my hand on in that a little bit, but yeah, it's a good point. All right, well, I know we're bumping right up to 1 o'clock. Did anyone else have anything, I don't know, questions or things anyone else wanted to bring up before we wrap?
I was going to ask Chris Milford if he would chime in. Chris, you have your own office. How do you guys operate?
You're asking a hard question. Hey, my office, hey, I'll tell you, I'm listening into this because I'm really interested to get the perspectives. About 4 or 5 years ago at this point, I started looking around for other opportunities. My project list was shrinking and my partner was retiring, and I found myself in an OPM position that was new to me in a lot of ways. But the reason I got hired as an OPM was specifically because of my background as an architect. They weren't looking for somebody to, manage the contractor and keep them on schedule and beat people down on pricing. They were looking for somebody to help them make good decisions. And that has been a really rewarding process to go through. It still requires me to pay attention to cost and schedule and focus on how I can help my client make good decisions to understand why the schedule might be changing because of their decisions or why the costs might be increasing because of their decisions. But I think it ends up with a much better project. And I struggle with this because most of the OPMs out there are from the construction background. They are knowledgeable to the ins and outs of how projects get done and where hidden costs are and how contractors think. And I don't have those skills. So it's been a real challenge to try and find that pathway between those two worlds to get to a good result. And we're still working on it.
Well, it sounds like it would be valuable to have you on that OPM team with the kind of design perspective and, yeah, like you said, as an architect, that kind of background.
The thing that's interesting that I learned in this position as OPM is I really need to let the architect be the architect. I really need to get out of the way of the client and the architect having a conversation about what they want as an end result and help both of them to achieve that instead of becoming the third opinion in the room.
And I'm curious, as an OPM now, having been an architect and been on the other side, do you have any, I don't know, like lessons having switched over to the other side that you would want to share with PMs still on the other side? Yeah.
I don't have any good lessons yet.
Okay.
I'm still trying to distill this role and how, and how I can take the skills that I do well and really bring value to the client. This is what contracting OPMs tend to bring to the table for most people is we'll help you manage this budget and we'll stay within the budget. And until you tell me you want to go over it, that's where we're going to stay, and we'll make whatever sacrifices you need to make in order to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have that skill. I can see why making a choice is going to end up with a significantly better result, even though it's additional costs. I
Right.
don't think I'm interested in, Drake's far more skilled in this than I am in terms of understanding sort of both sides of the table. And I think his comments have really been very interesting today in terms of how he looks at that role within an architectural firm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this has been a very helpful conversation.
Rosalind, if I might add something for the future meetings,
Yeah, sure.
you have a great list, and that list is something that will show up in job openings in various uh, people looking for employees. But you can use that list for your future meetings by selecting particular topics. So, for example, not really stressed here is QC/QA. Now, one of the fundamental roles of the project architect is making sure that the work that he or she is producing is of the standard of care that the industry requires of us. QC/QA is also something that the project manager can play a big role in. Orchestrating that, I think, would be a good subject for a future discussion.
Yeah, it's so
Uh,
fun. Sorry, I was just gonna say it's so funny you mentioned that because also internally something we're talking about, and I'm specifically like on my list for SOM. Sorry, go ahead.
So that's one topic. One of the other topics that we've sort of obliquely touched on is the importance of training and mentoring in a firm. I think Laura has left us, but what we do in our firms to bring the younger, less experienced people to greater levels of understanding and better experience and hopefully greater satisfaction, I think is an important role for the office leadership. And I think project managers play a great role in that. At one firm that I worked, they set up a QC/QA team that touched on this subject as well. They created a 3-part QC/QA leadership team. One part dealt with construction administration, one part dealt with production and documentation, and the third one dealt with general education. I was the education director, and we used all of the project's senior people to create I guess it's a syllabus, if you will, of specific and well scripted lectures or courses covering all the stuff that the architectural firm needs to do, particularly in the production side. So, so what we would do is we would have lectures on finishes and drywall and interiors. We'd have another lecture on masonry construction. We'd have another lecture on code, so that all of the subjects that people are responsible for would be addressed at one point or another by one of these lectures. So the way the firm handled it was the director of the program didn't give any of the lectures. Basically, my role was to make sure that the lectures were given. The people who gave them were the senior people. So what they did is they wrote out each of the presentations, and individual leaders would then give those lectures once a month or twice a month. They would have somebody talk over lunch and present this information. It was not required for people to attend, but those who attended would be noted in their annual reviews and in their bonuses. If you were interested in learning more about something, the firm recognized that and encouraged it. So that was another part of the learning curve that project managers can play a big role in, is helping people learn more about specific individual parts of what we do.
Yeah, and actually to that point, I feel like that would support people in the PA role and growing in that direction as well, because these are very like technical topics. The people who are actually going to be doing the drawing and the detailing too. So it's kind of another way to support people who are growing in that department, I think. So great. Yeah, thank you for the suggestions. I've noted them. Okay, I know we're past 1 o'clock. I know I have a 1 o'clock meeting I gotta jump over to. Thank you everyone for joining. And we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank-
Thanks.